Chapter 30 of Revelations, Part 1. The walk out of Saber's domain was quiet. His thralls escorted Twilight and Midnight to the winding stairwell at the bottom of the spire, their eyes like dim, flickering lanterns as they moved between the scars of the ancient battle that had ended the world. Neither mare said anything, but Twilight could feel her dark passenger deep in thought. Her own thoughts felt sluggish and distant, trickling over her like water from a frozen stream. Her hooves moved of their own accord as she descended the dark, winding crystal stairs to the enchanted door of black wood, where the ebony gem affixed at its peak stared back at her impassively. It didn't confront her with nightmares and visions this time. It swung open silently as she approached, and clicked shut behind her with a quiet thud that echoed with heavy finality. Twilight leaned back against it and looked out at the smothering darkness that waited just a few steps away from her flickering horn. There was a moment, between breaths, where she felt the true, terrifying weight of everything. The irreversible corruption of her own soul, the faith of her friends depending on her to make things right, Celestia's ultimate failure, and the deal she had struck with the malevolent entity that no doubt would betray her as soon as it could. Her chest tightened as she imagined herself delivering Luna to Saber's throne room, watching as he ate her corruption, broke free, and then went on to consume Midnight. She saw an image of mutated crystal ponies turning on her friends, dragging them out of their rooms as they slept, and enslaving them with the same dark magic that had brought Equestria to its knees. It all bore down on her at once with a dread so deep, she felt the breath catch in her throat. Then, she breathed out, stood up, and started up the smooth crystal steps at a determined trot. The weight was gone, replaced with a purposeful energy.
We need a plan.
She kept her eyes forward, but Midnight always lingered in the edges of her vision, appearing behind every curve.
We can't trust Saber, and we need to be ready for him to betray us. You were very upset when he misunderstood you. Huh? When he thought you were offering me to trade, you were upset.
There was a deliberateness to the way she spoke.
Oh, well, I was upset.
Twilight shook her head as she tried to recover her train of thought.
We know that Saber can't hurt us, at least when we're well rested. But he might be able to after feeding on Luna. Maybe we could use the crystal shard cadence left us to weaken him? But he'd be able to feel it, surely, and he'd know we were planning something.
Midnight didn't respond for several seconds.
I found it interesting that Saber was created by his host. Intentionally.
Twilight's brow furrowed.
Yes, I suppose. I can't imagine why he'd put himself through that.
She let out a thoughtful hum, watching her reflection in the crystal as she walked. It was hard to see the bags under her eyes when they were framed with old bloodstains.
Do you think there's a fundamental difference between Saber and other weirds? We know that Celestia was nearly able to dominate him, so perhaps anyone strong enough could? And there seems to be other facets to his magic as well. Could we learn those ourselves? You can't imagine it?
Midnight appeared on the steps in front of her, head cocked.
Yet the threat of losing me angered you.
Twilight drew up short, looking up and meeting Midnight's eyes. They were wide and curious. Nervous.
What are you talking about? Saber implied he would destroy me,
Midnight said. Her lips moved as she spoke, but in a poor and ill-timed imitation of speech.
And you were angry. You told him to never bring it up again. Of course I did.
Twilight walked through her with only a slight stumble, quickly returning to her brisk pace.
But right now, we need to...
Midnight was in front of her again.
What are we, Twilight?
Twilight frowned, finally coming to a stop. The question took her off guard, and she answered almost without thinking, reluctant to let go of her previous thoughts.
Well, we're friends, right? That's how I like to think of us, at least. That's not what I mean.
Midnight huffed and began to circle her, walking first over empty air on one side, then through the reflective surface of crystal on the other. Twilight followed Midnight with her head for a moment, before starting back up the steps.
There's a lot on my mind right now. Can you be clearer?
Midnight let out a low growl, hunching her shoulders and lowering her head, but didn't stop her ghostly pacing. They climbed in silence for several seconds, the tangible buzz of consternation coming from Midnight's mind, making it difficult for Twilight to focus. Just as she began to put the odd questions behind her, reasoning that Midnight would try again whenever she was ready, her thoughts were interrupted again.
What do I mean to you?
That was an easy one. Twilight offered a sincere smile, answering without breaking stride.
I just told you, Midnight. You're my friend. Rainbow Dash is your friend.
Midnight pressed.
Is that the same as what we are?
Twilight's smile widened.
Of course. But it's not the same.
Midnight appeared in front of her, appearing to slide backwards up the stairs without moving her legs.
Not even close. A friend is a friend, Midnight,
Twilight said patiently.
No matter what?
Midnight stayed squarely in the center of Twilight's vision, forcing her to try and lean around her to see the stairs.
You forged your bond with Rainbow Dash when you faced the nightmare together. But you only knew me when I had to fight you for control of your body. You've known her for a year, but we've been together only a month. And every time you grew frustrated or upset with her foolishness, you would retreat to your home to rest. But you can't do that with me now, can you? We're trapped together, ceaselessly.
Twilight slowed to a stop, looking to Midnight with a cock of her head.
Midnight? Have you been studying my friendships? That doesn't matter,
Midnight snapped.
How can these partnerships be the same when so much is different between them? Okay, so they aren't exactly the same,
Twilight admitted. She paused, measuring her words carefully.
But just because every friendship is unique doesn't mean any one is less or more important. Both of you are still my friends.
Midnight stared back at her, her fanged, bloody mouth hanging open for several seconds.
What about best friends?
Twilight blinked.
What do you mean? Some friends are greater than others, are they not? You call mini ponies friends, but it is only your 5 closest that you think of as best friends.
Midnight leaned in.
You say your friendship with Rainbow Dash is alike to your friendship with me. So are we best friends? We're very good friends,
Twilight said uncertainly. She resumed trotting up the stairs, stumbling only slightly as she walked through Midnight.
We don't have time for me to explain this fully. We still haven't come up with a plan for Shaper. Shaper is a rat bound to the bottom of a pit,
Midnight said dismissively.
He isn't going anywhere. But these questions are, apparently?
Twilight asked dryly, shooting an exasperated look at Midnight.
Aren't you the one who's always saying we need to focus on what matters? This does matter!
Midnight snapped.
Does it?
Twilight demanded, quickening her pace.
Does it matter more than keeping Shaper contained? More than waking up Luna and curing the corruption? It's more important to me!
Twilight let out a guttural groan.
We're friends, Midnight. I'm closer to you every day than I've ever been to another pony in my entire life. Isn't that enough? No, We are!
Midnight stomped an ethereal hoof, causing one of Twilight's hoofs to slam down against the crystal in sympathy.
I must know where we stand! Tell me!
Twilight planted her hooves and jerked to a stop, turning back with half a mind to start running down, anything to find some peace, but Midnight was right behind her.
What do you want? What exactly do you want me to do? Answer the question!
Midnight shouted. Twilight sucked in a deep breath, pouring all her stress and anxiety into her response.
I don't know the answer!
Her chest heaved as she stared down at Midnight, who stared back at her with her jaw hanging half open. She counted to 10 as she waited, eyes wide, leaning in expectation of some other unanswerable question to be piled on top of everything else she had to deal with, but none came. She turned sharply, starting back up the stairs, and was relieved when Midnight opted to hover next to her, instead of blocking the path. Twilight wasn't sure how long they spent in silence. She kept trying to focus on Shaper, on Luna, on anything, but her thoughts slipped away half-formed, dissolving into the fretful buzz occupying her mind and the fluttering nerves in her chest. Finally, Midnight spoke, her voice quiet and plaintive.
You can find out. No, I can't.
Twilight kept her eyes forward.
Why not?
Twilight closed her eyes and took a deep, calming breath. The crystal steps were perfectly spaced apart, and her hooves moved on their own as she struggled to keep her voice steady.
I know you're inexperienced with this kind of thing, Midnight, but some questions have answers that can't be found through careful study. Think of all the things you've learned since Canterlot. Not about the past, not about the world, but about yourself.
She opened her eyes again, trying to keep her voice steady.
Those weren't simple questions either, were they?
There was another long silence.
But I found the answers. Yes, you did,
Twilight snapped.
Over weeks, with days of uneventful travel where you did nothing but sit in my head and poke fun at me and insult everything in sight. You didn't have me constantly demanding explanations of your nature while we were fighting the Crystal Spiders, did you?
She huffed, reining herself in again.
Everyone is depending on me, Midnight. All of my friends are out there thinking, Twilight will fix it. Twilight will know what to do. Even I'm thinking it.
She threw her head back with a bitter laugh.
You don't feel it. The stress, the expectations, the weight. You have your simple little world of monsters and friends, and your insane confidence that you'll always win. But I don't. That's not...
Midnight interrupted herself with a frustrated snarl.
You know our nature. You expect me to just not question it?
Twilight worked her jaw side to side.
Question what? Am I here forever? Do I have a place here?
Midnight hesitated, her next words coming out in a rush.
Do you want me?
Twilight stopped. She turned to face Midnight fully, her anger fading.
Those are...
She grimaced, ears drooping.
Really complicated questions.
Midnight's bloodshot eyes flicked back and forth.
But you can answer them.
Twilight shook her head.
I can't do that right now. Then when? I don't know. When will you know? I don't know that either. But why not? I just don't.
Twilight snapped, her anger coming back in a sudden rush.
Why can't you just drop this? Because I need to know.
Midnight brought her hooves up to grab Twilight's cheeks, the ethereal touch brushing over her face with a warm numbness.
I need to know right now! Why right now?
Twilight stepped back out of reach.
You didn't need to know yesterday or any day before that. Why is it so important to you to get this answer right now? Because I don't understand this anymore!
Midnight cried, and her voice echoed in Twilight's mind with enough force to make her wince.
What are we? I used to know! I was feared, hated, unwanted, but I was the only thing that could save you from your own feeble doubts! I had accepted that place. I was ready to face the moment when one of us would succumb to the other!
She turned away with a flick of her tail, stomping into the crystal wall and replacing Twilight's reflection.
But then, you came to accept me. You tried to teach me. You defend me. When you're offered a chance to be rid of me, you answer not with relief, but with fury.
She turned back, fixing Twilight with a wide-eyed glare.
Shaper was the first of my kind, created by Saber millennia ago to fill a purpose, and even now, they seek to destroy one another. What happens if we stop fighting? What are we?
Twilight shook her head, looking up and spotting the top of the stairs. A slab of smooth black crystal seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and she could just make out the faint outline of arcane runes engraved into its surface.
None of that matters, Midnight.
She took a step forward.
We have a job to do.
A wave of emotion struck Twilight, filling her chest with a sudden, intense pain that brought her to her knees. She gasped, straightening up, and actually looked at Midnight. Her hair was a mess, hanging down and framing her face in frayed, bloody ropes. The red stains that ran down her cheeks were glistening with fresh tears, and her fanged teeth were clenched tight enough to make her jaw shudder with every breath. Her nostrils flared, and she raised a hoof as if to run or charge, then set it back down a moment later, opening her mouth only to let out a wordless growl.
I'm sorry.
Twilight pushed herself back to her hooves, struggling to form words past the tangled waves of emotion spilling out over her connection to Midnight.
I'm sorry, it does matter.
Midnight squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head and turning away.
I'll make you a promise, okay?
Twilight licked her lips, rushing forward to pull Midnight into a hug. She felt her own hooves wrap around her shoulders, and her own chest heaving with strained breath.
I can't answer your questions right now. Not with so much else on my mind. But if you can help me figure out how to deal with Shaper, together, then the very first moment we get to relax, we'll sit down and we'll find the answers, you and me. Promise?
Midnight didn't respond, but she didn't break the hug either. A strong shudder passed through Twilight's body.
Please?
Twilight's brow furrowed, and after a moment of silence, she tried a different approach.
I can't face Shaper on my own.
Midnight vanished. Twilight's hooves fell to the ground, and she turned in place, searching. But she only saw plain crystal and empty shadow. The stress and pain that had brought her to her knees faded as quickly as it appeared, and for a moment she couldn't feel Midnight's presence at all. And she was afraid. When she completed her circle, she saw Midnight standing at the top of the steps. Her mane was pulled back into place, and the bloodstains on her cheeks were dark and dry. The crystal rumbled as a door opened above her, letting in a flurry of snow and the warm red flickers of firelight.
You're right. You could never face Shaper on your own.
Midnight looked down with a haughty glare. There was a moment where the mask cracked, giving Twilight a glimpse of something softer underneath, and then Midnight turned away, jerking her head towards the open doorway.
You need me, little flower.
Twilight blinked, taking a weary step forward. Midnight remained still, flicking her tail in the same impatient display Twilight had seen 100 times before. She let out a breath of relief, a small smile tugging at her lips as she passed Midnight and came out onto the windswept peak of the tower she'd begun her descent from. The crystal ponies were gone, and the fur curtains were drawn back, revealing the glow of the approaching dawn to the east. The door slid shut behind her with the grinding of crystal on crystal, and Twilight saw Midnight looking out over the icy lake surrounding the city with an imperious frown.
Yes,
she said, her smile widening.
I really do.
Rainbow Dash let out a loud belch, frowning at the surreal aftertaste of blood soup that followed. It felt like she had been nursing the same bowl for hours, taking little sips between rounds of storytelling and dancing. The crystal ponies seemed amused at her struggle. They kept proposing toasts, leaving her surrounded by smirking hunters that would watch her from the corners of their eyes as they downed the drink from hefty crystal goblets, and she'd grin back, push down the steadily increasing queasiness in her gut, and then take a little sip. Not that she wasn't up to the challenge. She had made a bet with Star Trails that she would be able to finish a full bowl before dawn, and she was not going to back down. The warm hall had been eerily silent after Twilight said her goodbyes and followed Ametrine out into the icy cold night. Every pony stood still with their eyes raised toward the ceiling, where old yak hide stretched out across bone struts served as a macabre canvas for drawings of great hunts and heroes from their past. Even the foals took part, though they couldn't resist the urge to twitch their hooves or bump playfully into their friends with poorly concealed grins. Rainbow, Applejack, and Star Trails were left exchanging awkward looks amongst themselves, each unwilling to break the silence. Finally, the sound of crystal grinding against crystal announced Ametrine's return, and she gave a solemn nod as she smiled down over the gathered ponies. The cheers and stomping that answered her were enough to make Rainbow's teeth chatter. The hours passed quickly after that, as the mares bounced from one circle to another, each one draping new trinkets or jewelries over their shoulders, shoving new meals into their hooves, a few of which were even vegetarian, and continuing to welcome them profusely to their little village. Calloused hunters asked after Rainbow's and Applejack scars, and told the stories of how they'd earned their own markings. Wide-eyed foals asked endless questions about the warmer world to the south, completely unfazed whenever Rainbow had to shrug and explain that she really had no clue as to how their airships worked, or how the islands floated, or why chickens laid eggs. And at one point, Rainbow lost track of Star Trails only to find her an hour later deeply engrossed in a conversation with an old mare about the stars, and comparing the constellations used by the crystal ponies and the equestrians for navigation. But there was still that little, jittery anxiety lingering in Rainbow's wings. She couldn't ignore it no matter how many stories she told, or jokes she heard, or glittering crystals were woven into her mane. Every now and then, she'd have a moment to herself and she would turn, hoping to see Twilight approaching with a bowl of soup, a fanged smile, and a story about how she'd found the thing they needed to save Equestria. How long would it take for her to return, she wondered. How long before she should go down after her? Rainbow hated waiting. Finally, the celebration began to wind down. Tired foals were picked up or guided back to the little tents where they slept in circles around burning braziers, while adults scrubbed at dishes with little hoof-sized balls of coarse yak fur. Many of the elders had dozed off in their seats around the glowing crystal pipes that hummed quietly in the center of the room, though some stayed up and continued to reminisce, ensuring no drink went to waste. Rainbow stood off to the side with Applejack and Star Trails near the big crystal doors that led back outside.
This place is amazing!
Trails grinned like a little filly in a candy store as she looked out over the chamber.
You know, I've read stories about little holdouts like this. Islands that remained isolated for centuries longer than the others and developed their own unique cultures. I never thought I'd get to discover one myself.
Yeah, sure is something. Applejack shook her head, a wistful look in her eye. Reckon this is what Twilight felt like when she stumbled on my family reunion.
Do you think she's okay?
Rainbow asked, glancing up to the smaller door set halfway up into the far side of the chamber that Twilight had been led through. Try and relax, R.D. Applejack draped a comforting leg over her shoulder and pulled her into a sideways hug. I've been strung up like a cat in a henhouse all night. Who knows when we'll get a chance like this again, you hear? Rainbow rolled her eye, but leaned into the hug.
It'd be better if we were all together.
She pursed her lips, looking towards Trails.
How long do you think Saber will wait?
Trails cocked her head.
What do you mean? She may have issues with you two, but I know she wouldn't leave me here. No, I mean, what if Twilight doesn't show up for a week? Or a month?
Rainbow said.
How long until Saber decides she's wasting her time and tries to sell off Luna again? Oh.
Trails grimaced, looking away and scratching at the floor.
I don't know, Dash. Saber's under a lot of pressure right now. She's probably just as nervous as you are, you know, even if she doesn't show it.
She blinked, ears perking up.
Though it looks like we won't have to wait.
Rainbow followed her gaze, letting out a small gasp as she spotted Twilight, standing on the balcony Ametrine had used to tell the first story of the feast. She had stepped back from the ledge, far enough that the crystal ponies, who had all either retired to their tents or were gathered towards the middle of the room, couldn't see her. Twilight met Rainbow's gaze for a brief moment, her expression distant and pensive. It was a face Rainbow recognized well. The same one that the studious unicorn often wore when she was dragged away from whatever project she had spent 3 days straight on, and forced to attend some activity with her friends. It took concentrated effort to snap her out of that daze, and usually even then she'd only offer up a quick smile and token response, maybe a minute of conversation, before withdrawing back into her reverie. Twilight offered a small smile. Her horn glowed, and she vanished with a quiet pop.
Wait!
Rainbow said. Too late. She flared her wings, ignoring the curious looks from the crystal ponies, and turned to Applejack.
Where'd she go?
Have I no idea, Applejack said, brow furrowing under her hat. Maybe she's concerned about disturbing the crystal ponies by showing back up? I kind of figured they thought she was going on a one-way trip.
Maybe she went back to the Argo?
Trail suggested.
That would be a logical place to meet us, right? Yeah, good idea.
Rainbow jumped into the air, shoving one of the heavy crystal doors open with a grunt of effort and a few powerful wing beats. A flurry of snow filtered inside, carrying the pale blue light of dawn.
I'll go find her.
Whoa, Artie, hold up! Rainbow was already out into the open air. She grinned as the cold wind snipped at her cheeks, pumping her wings and putting on speed as she angled herself toward the silhouette of the Argo. It was loitering a respectful, or perhaps cautious, distance to the east, appearing to float just above the sun as it crested the horizon and highlighted the icy landscape with meandering rivers of silver. Her pulse quickened from the sudden activity, the familiar burn of her muscles driving her on. It took her barely 30 seconds to reach the ship, zipping up underneath it and landing lightly on top of the docked submarine. The wind tugged at her mane as she spun the wheel on the hatch and jumped inside, pulling it shut and letting out a shuddering breath as a last breeze of cold air swirled around her hooves.
Twilight?
Rainbow looked up and down the hall before trotting towards the cargo hold, the floor's metal plating rattling under her hoof. She raised her voice, trying again.
Twi, you here?
The heavy doors to the cargo hold parted before her with the hiss of steam, and Rainbow jumped inside with wings twitching, ready to fly a circuit of the hold if necessary to find her friend. There was no need, however. Twilight's head was poking out past the curtained door of her room, watching as she appeared.
Hey, Rainbow,
she said, fangs showing with another smile.
I'm glad you came.
She held the curtain open, beckoning with a jerk of her head.
You couldn't have waited for me to catch up back there?
Rainbow asked, stepping into the little room. She saw Princess Luna asleep on Twilight's bed, and an old bedroll neatly squared away on a corner of the floor, currently occupied by Twilight's weird crystal spider pet. It clicked its jaws in greeting.
What's going on? Sorry.
Twilight let the curtain fall and stepped over to her desk, horn coming to life. A few old books floated up off the tarnished tin surface and slipped into her saddlebags. Her mane seemed to glow as she plucked the jewelry the crystal ponies had given her out of her hair, setting them down in a pile along with several bracelets and necklaces.
We don't know how the crystal ponies will react if they see us, and I didn't want to take the risk. Us?
Rainbow frowned, catching the way that Twilight stiffened briefly.
What did you find out? Or do you want to wait for AJ first?
Twilight took a breath and closed her eyes, shaking her head.
I don't think there's really time to explain it all. Not well enough, at least. But look, I think I found a way to wake up Luna.
She turned to the sleeping alicorn, the lavender glow of her magic wrapping around her body.
But I have to do it myself. It's too dangerous for you girls to go down there. It's almost too dangerous for me.
She paused, pursing her lips and looked away before saying in a quieter tone.
It shouldn't take me long. You're leaving? Again?
Rainbow grabbed her shoulder, trying to catch her eye.
Twi, come on! At least tell me what you're doing. How long will you be gone? What do we do if you don't come back?
Twilight looked over, meeting Rainbow's eye for just an instant before turning away again. In that moment, Rainbow saw through the calm, confident facade her friend was putting on. She seemed to sway briefly where she stood, as if struggling to hold up some great weight, her eyes darting about, focused on distant, looming threats that only she could see. She sucked in a shaky breath, closing her eyes, and when she opened them again, the moment was gone.
I'll be back,
she said. Her horn burst into light, and Rainbow drew her leg back with a yelp as a sudden burst of magic crackled against her hoof. Twilight was gone again, and this time she had taken Luna with her.
Twilight!
Rainbow called, looking around as loose papers fluttered in the wake of the teleportation. She grimaced as she turned in place, jaw clenching, that old feeling of helplessness rearing its ugly head again. She hated that feeling. She wished it was as easy to kill as a pony was. She trotted back out into the cargo hold, grinding her teeth and flicking her tail. She opened her mouth to call Twilight's name again, then shut it with an angry growl. What was the point? Twilight wasn't there anymore. Rainbow stomped back through the cargo hold door, intending to fly down and tell Applejack what had happened, only to draw up short as she turned a corner and came face to face with Saber.
Rainbow Dash?
Saber's frown deepened ever so lightly.
I left Trails a radio for when the feast was done.
Sorry.
Rainbow stepped around her.
I was just leaving.
I heard you calling Twilight's name,
Saber said, stopping her in place.
Is she back?
Rainbow considered her answer for a long moment. Her brow furrowed as she shook her head, pushing out a bitter
no.
She was glad that Saber didn't push the matter. Within a minute, Rainbow had made her way back through the hatch, jumped down past the docked submarine into the open air, and settled into a steep glide down to the Crystal Tower. Applejack and Star Trails were already standing outside when she landed on the outcropping of crystal that jutted out from the tower. They stood close together, near the wall, sharing the heat of their bodies and protected from the wind by the tower's bulk.
Did you find her?
Applejack called, adjusting her hat with a huff.
I did. Not that it matters.
Rainbow growled darkly. She sat opposite Applejack and tossed her mane.
She took Luna and disappeared again.
Whoa, she took Luna?
Trails asked, looking between the two.
Where?
I don't know. Back into the spire, I guess.
Rainbow spat.
She didn't explain anything. She keeps talking about we and us, but she wouldn't tell me what she was doing.
Applejack let out a quiet grunt.
Maybe she ain't meaning the same we y'all think she's meaning.
There was a moment of silence. Rainbow's brow furrowed, her frustration giving way to confusion.
What do you mean?
Well, she's still got that thing in her head, don't she? She's even named it. What do you reckon the odds are that maybe it's more in control than we think?
Applejack grimaced.
Heck, maybe it's even taken control altogether, and that was only pretending to be our Twilight.
That? No. No!
Rainbow gave a forceful shake of her head.
There's no way!
I mean...
Trails started slowly.
That changeling probably could have tricked us into thinking it was Sunfeather if we weren't on guard already.
Rainbow blinked, her mouth opening and closing twice before she could find her voice.
That was different. You said yourself you don't really know Sunfeather, but Twilight's my best friend. We would know if some changeling tried to replace her.
But we ain't talking about just a changeling,
Applejack said.
Truth is, Sugar Cube, we don't really know what we might be up against.
A gust of wind blew past, stirring snow around their hooves and sending a shiver through Rainbow's body. She didn't know what to say. She'd been concerned before that Twilight might have been different when they reunited, but once the moment had come, all her fears had melted away. Twilight was a little different, maybe even a lot different, but she was still Twilight. Right?
Huh.
Trails stepped past her, head cocked as she focused on something behind her.
Is that?
Rainbow turned, following the unicorn's gaze. A small dark spot was cresting the horizon, silhouetted by the sun. She raised a wing to shade her face as she squinted towards it, trying to gauge its shape.
Looks like a ship,
Trails said.
Definitely a ship. What would a ship be doing all the way up here?
Applejack asked, coming up to Rainbow's left. They watched in confused silence for a moment as the shape grew bigger, widening out into a pair of smooth ship's envelopes. A slender metal hull was suspended between them, pushed along by a trio of propellers placed in a triangle on the rear. A second ship began to crest the horizon behind it, but Rainbow was still focused on the first one, trying to identify the strange protrusion on its deck.
This can't be good,
Trails said. She raised a hoof to her ear, where a small radio headset was tucked away, half hidden by her mane.
Argo, Trails, contact south, 2 ships, far.
Her horn glowed, brow furrowing in concentration. And then her eyes shot wide open.
Oh, fuck! What?
Rainbow asked, looking between the unicorn and the steadily approaching airships.
What's wrong? That thing has guns on it!
Trails shouted. She tapped her radio again, rushing through her words.
Argo, evade! Evade! Armed ships, south!
Rainbow's pulse quickened, her wings flaring up uncertainly at the sudden distress in Trails' voice. There was a flash of light from the first airship, and she caught a brief burst of movement, barely perceptible save for the snow flurrying in front of it. Seconds later, an explosion erupted above her. Rainbow yelped, throwing herself to the ground and covering her head as a wave of heat washed down over her back. Chunks of crystal rained down around her, bouncing with sharp cracks and pings that made her ears ring, and a distant roll of thunder rumbled through the air.
Ah! Rainbow, AJ, get back inside!
Trails hauled Rainbow up off the ground with a grunt, turning to help Applejack up next. Rainbow looked up, blinking in shock at the smoke curling around a huge crack in the side of the tower above her. Black scorch marks stained the crystal, small shards glittering in the dawning light as they spiraled down around her.
Ah! What's happening? Remember that bounty on our heads?
Trails quipped, pushing her into motion.
I don't know how they found us, but someone's come to collect.